Good morning, students. One of the researchers who conducted a study on cannabis use and depression, Dr. George Patton, is coming to talk to us today.
Thank you, Ms. Teacher. The title of our study is Cannabis Use and Mental Health in Young People, a cohort study. So I'll tell you a bit about our studies. We wanted to see whether teenagers who use cannabis later develop anxiety and depression in young adulthood. To do so, we followed roughly 2,000 students from 44 schools in Victoria, Australia, aged 14 to 15 for 7 years. For our purposes, the exposure was frequency of cannabis use, while the outcome was depression and anxiety in Wave 7. As per our panel cohort, we recruited students based on their exposure status, then followed them through time, collecting questionnaires over 7 waves to determine levels of cannabis use, their exposure, as well as depression and anxiety simultaneously. We then aggregated data from waves 1 to 6 and compared that to wave 7 in order to explore whether teenage cannabis use leads to depression and anxiety in young adulthood.
We are the Epi Public Health Nerds, and we don't approve your message.
And we don't agree with your results.
That's really rude. Please let me continue with my presentation. As I was saying, we first administered a survey to students through computer-based questionnaires and telephoned students who were absent from school that day. We did this every 6 months for the first 6 waves, then the last questionnaire at wave 7 was a telephone interview.
Well, first of all, doing that may lead to differential information bias. Your lack of consistency of data collection between students throughout the study could result in bias.
The use of the telephone interviews may have been subject to ascertainment bias since the interview may have known the participants' exposure or outcome status from previous waves. With researchers not being masked to this information, it could cause them to probe or not to probe particular individuals. For example, this could lead to an overrepresentation of those who use cannabis or who are depressed or anxious and thus bias results away from the null. This would occur if the researchers probed those who were previously depressed or anxious and assumed they still were.
On the other hand, the ascertainment bias may lead to a researcher underrepresenting those who did not normally use cannabis or who were not depressed or anxious in the previous waves, because the interviewer may not probe as much, and perhaps lead to the bias towards the null.
Another type of information bias stems from the data collection. For waves 1 through 6, students received written questionnaires while at school. Those who were absent from school completed the questionnaires via telephone. For wave 7, the researchers collected answers via telephone interviews, which was different from waves 1 through 6. This lack of consistency in data collection throughout the study could result in bias.
For example, the telephone questionnaires you conducted may have been more personal. Just saying hello in a telephone call changes the dynamics of the interview, making it more personal than a questionnaire.
I noticed that you interviewed in 6-month intervals for waves 1 through 6, but then for wave 7 you waited 1 year. There is the potential for differential recall bias to occur if you do that. For the questionnaire in wave 7, the students had to recall their cannabis use a year back. Therefore, it is possible that those who never used cannabis easily remembered that they definitely did not use cannabis, whereas students who used cannabis and did so infrequently may have had more difficulty recalling their exposure history. From this perspective, then, this would lead to differential misclassification. This would be biased away or towards the null depending on whether the users overestimated or underestimated their cannabis use in each particular exposure category.
Well, dagnabbit, looks like you got me there.
Now, let's conduct an example with alcohol right here, right now, in Megan's Epi 597 class for a real-life example. How many alcoholic drinks have you had this year? 0, 1 to 15, 16 to 99, or more than 100? Isn't remembering a year back really hard? It was probably easiest if you never drink, so you know you fit into the zero category. This is similar to what happened in the study at Wave 7, and you can see that misclassification is a real possibility.
Anyways, back to the study. Social desirability bias is also a huge issue here. It is possible that cannabis users or students who were depressed or anxious were hesitant to tell the truth about how much cannabis they use or their psychological state. Although the survey was claimed to be anonymous, since it was conducted in a school setting, many students may have felt their answers would be judged or read by their teachers. This would lead to differential misclassification, since those who actually use cannabis and those that are actually depressed would feel pressure to hide this information. This would bias the exposure and the outcome data towards the null.
Just wait a minute. Let me at least present some findings on the strong association we found and the predicting nature of cannabis usage. Using fancy multivariate logistic regression models, we adjusted for the following confounders: parental separation, parental education, current smoking, frequency of drinking, and use of illicit drugs. We then stratified daily cannabis use by gender to get adjusted odds ratios for females and males. In Wave 7, female daily users had 5.6 times the odds of reporting depression and anxiety than men who use cannabis daily, whose odds were 1.1. In other words, we found a strong association between daily use of cannabis and depression and anxiety in young women, even after adjustment. As you can see by the following odds ratios, daily female users, those who smoked more than 5 times per week, were the only ones with significant odds ratios because all the other ones had confidence intervals that spanned both sides of 1. As seen by the above odds ratios, the only one that is shown to be harmful is for daily female users, those who smoke more than 5 times per week, because their confidence interval is entirely on the positive side of 1.
Hey now, I noticed that the confidence interval or the odds ratio of 5.6 is very wide, which indicates more random error than would a narrow interval.
The biases that we pointed out earlier could lead to a really big OR of 5.6 for female users. Also, confounding could inflate the true value of this OR.
For example, mental health is complex and many confounders may influence the outcome of developing anxiety or depression. Important confounders that were not accounted for statistically are socioeconomic status, ethnicity, psychiatric family history, use of prescription medication, and age. Additionally, it has been shown that women tend to show anxiety and depression much more than men, regardless of exposure. It is possible that once these confounders are taken into account, the odds of becoming depressed or anxious in daily female users decreases.
Right there, smarty pants. If the study is so bad, then what would you do differently?
The data on cannabis use and anxiety and depression were collected at each wave simultaneously. This causes temporal ambiguity at Wave 1 especially. In participants who are both cannabis users and depressed or anxious, it is unclear which came first.
Impromptu question, folks. At what age do you think puberty starts affecting mood? 8 to 10? 10 to 12? 12 to 14? Or 14 plus? You probably all thought the answer was before 14. Well, not the authors.
For example, in the current study design, the researchers started the study at around the onset of puberty, which could be responsible for the depression they saw in students. To combat this, we would start the study even earlier than the researchers did. Perhaps we would start at age 10 to ensure that we are starting with students who are not experiencing puberty-related depression.
Okay, I can see what you're saying. At least my categories were good, right?
Not quite. For the overall frequency of cannabis usage, the authors state that they grouped students based on their most extreme usage status among the first 6 waves. By this logic, a student who was a heavy user in the first wave, then completely abstinent for the last 6 waves, are grouped together with someone who was a daily user the whole time. This would bias the results away from the null by increasing the number of high-frequency users. Instead, we would assign a numerical value to each frequency category, like the ones you see on the screen, and report a mean value to account for usage through waves 1 through 6. This would yield average usage among students rather than their maximum usage across the waves, which we believe to be much more representative.
We'll cut you some slack. You did have 2,032 participants, which is a large sample size, and this could increase statistical power. And given budget constraints, you had a pretty representative sample as you randomly selected 2 classes from each of the randomly selected 44 high schools. Also, you used a well-established standardized test to rate depression and anxiety, which has been shown to accurately identify depressive symptoms in participants.
However, we don't agree with the results your study produced because of the biases and confounding that were present. We understand that exploring this association between cannabis usage and psychological effects is important, and we suggest more research in the area.
As of now, this association is pretty hazy.